Evening. Tonight we're going to discuss some music. I think we need to do more of that. I've listened to music a long time and love discussing some of my favorite albums and music and just all things about music. This is Guitars and Music channel. I hope you'll consider subscribing. We discuss music. I play guitar sometimes. Once in a while we review some gear, talk about guitars. But we're going to talk tonight about Blind Faith. You got the controversial cover. We'll show you the back. The inside, you've got the gatefold. This is an old copy of Blind Faith. So this is I bought this in high school. So and I actually had the American release, which had one of these. It wasn't actually one of these photos, but one of the black and white photos on the cover. The cover was kind of controversial. It has a sort of a prepubescent girl. But anyway, this is the album I've had a long time, and we're going to talk about Blind Faith. It was pretty much a 1969 thing. So they started in early 1969, and pretty much by the end of '69 it was done. So it's kind of easy to remember their dates. They were a 1969 band, and that's, of course, smack dab in the middle of the late '60s, which was a really cool time in music, also kind of a wild time in music, kind of a transitional time in music. FM rock really hadn't, the way, what we might consider a lot of classic rock that sort of came out of FM radio hadn't really evolved yet, but definitely you had the hard rock elements coming on. And this was, of course, the so-called Supergroup featuring Eric Clapton, Stevie Winwood from Traffic, Ginger Baker, also from Cream. Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker just coming out of Cream, which had just broken up. And then a bass player, a guy named Eric Grech. Some of you might not have heard of him, but he was in a band that was quite popular in England, never too popular in America, called Family. And he was a good guy. Unfortunately, he died many years ago of liver disease, and that sort of is another sad case. But a little bit of background to the Blind Faith album. I'll show it. I'll keep showing it to you. I'm just afraid I'm going to show you that front cover. But Blind Faith was a group that formed in 1969. Cream broke up in 1968, and of course that was Ginger Baker on drums, Jack Bruce on bass guitar, and Eric Clapton on guitar. That around that same time, Traffic also broke up, which was, of course, had Stevie Winwood, and Stevie Winwood and Eric Clapton kind of knew each other. And of course, Steve Winwood had also been in the Spencer Davis Group, which was a great sort of R&B band, and so they started talking about forming a group. And they got a guy named Eric Grech to play bass. He was kind of, a good, solid, professional level bass player that was around. But then they needed a drummer, and I think Stevie Winwood kind of wanted it. By the way, I'm going to also reference quite a bit of information from Eric Clapton's autobiography. He says some interesting things about Blind Faith. But Stevie Winwood wanted Ginger Baker in the band, and so did the record company producers. Now, the way Blind Faith kind of started, Eric Clapton wasn't really doing anything at the time. Of course, you're a young musician with all this energy. You want to be doing something. He didn't really have a band. Stevie Winwood didn't really have a band. And so they were kind of talking about forming a band. And then I wanted to say a little bit about the Ginger Baker thing. So Ginger Baker is a colorful figure, kind of a volatile figure. I think he's a lot more complicated than people give him credit for being. He's actually a great musician. I kind of admire drummers from afar, but he's a hard rock drummer, but he's also, like a lot of hard rock drummers, he's not just a basher. You could say about John Bonham and some of the really great quote-unquote hard rock drummers is they actually have a lot of nuances and musicianship in their playing. They're not just bashing away. But the record companies also kind of wanted Ginger Baker because then that made it a super group. And if you wanted to have a super group, you needed famous people. And of course, there weren't really any more famous drummers in the world at that time than Ginger Baker. So somewhat hesitantly, Eric Clapton agreed to be in this band, not only with Stevie Winwood, and then this guy named Eric Grech, who I think was just a good, solid, all-around bass player. He did definitely do the job. and was a nice guy, easy to work with, according to Eric Clapton. But then they ended up with Ginger Baker. Now that that was something in his autobiography. Clapton, kind of very delicately, I think he cares a lot about Ginger Baker. He wasn't cutting him down or anything, but he was a little hesitant about that because Ginger Baker, well, I think, was one of the problems with Cream. At any rate, they formed this supergroup, and there was a lot of hype around it. So I think it's hard for us to imagine today because Blind Faith has become such a famous band, even though you really don't hear their music that much. Eric Clapton plays a couple Blind Faith songs regularly in rotation on his tour, especially Presence of the Lord, and I think sometimes Can't Find My Way Home too, which is a Stevie Winwood song. But you don't really hear actually that much music that's really off this album. But one of the things that Clapton said is they needed to do an album and a tour, so they they didn't really have enough material. So that's an interesting thing. So there was a lot of hype around the group, but they kind of formed in a very hasty way. It was kind of, the record companies saw a lot of money in it. They didn't really have a lot of material. So they did a concert in Hyde Park, which, by the way, I've got playing on that TV behind me. There's Stevie Winwood there as we look. And people liked it. But Eric Clapton right away said he wasn't, in his autobiography, he said he wasn't really, even at that concert, was kind of in the background, kind of withdrawing from the group already. But they recorded an album. That's this album right here, which would be their one and only album, their eponymous album, Blind Faith. Couple interesting things about this album, little album review as it were. They didn't really have enough material for an album. And if you think about it, that's an interesting problem because no matter how, I've always said this, no matter how good you are as a musician, you have to have great songs and great material. I always think some of the guitar players you see, on Guitar Player magazine or YouTube, and some of them are amazing guitar players, but do they have good material? Because good songs, that's why a lot of great bands have a really great first album when they come out of bars, because they've got, and then they just cherry pick their very best songs. And they do this killer first album, but you've got to have good songs. And so one of the problems right away with Blind Faith is they didn't have a lot of really songs in the can that they knew. So that was kind of the issue right away, and I think you can see that on this album. Now, the album got kind of mixed reviews, but I think the word I would use is potential. I like this album. I think it's a great album. It's not listened to enough. It's not, people mention Blind Faith, almost part of history, but the music on it is pretty good. However, I do think there's some truth in the sort of off-cited criticism that they never really lived up to their potential. Stevie Winwood brought a couple good songs. You've got to have good songs into the recording. So I love, like, Can't Find My Way Home. That's a famous song a lot of you know. But a couple other songs on here. One is Sea of Joys. I was reading some of the reviews on Amazon, all the people that reviewed it, and so many people said they didn't like Sea of Joy. It's really a great song. And it's got something that was kind of interesting. It's got that kind of folksy element in it, and there's a Rick Grech violin solo in it. And it's kind of psychedelic folk rock. Another one on there is Had to Cry Today. Those are really good songs. And so Stevie Winwood brought those songs. Clapton wrote a new song for the album, or around that time he wrote a song that today is one of his enduring ones that he still plays a lot, which is Presence of the Lord. And then Eric Clapton also recommended, so they each got kind of their little slots. Eric Clapton also suggested doing a Buddy Holly tune, Well Alright, but you notice right away they're trying to just kind of do old cover tunes, which are kind of fun. There's nothing wrong with that, and I think they do a good version of Well Alright. But it sort of shows you that it's not like they've got all this music they have to pick from. They're kind of scrambling to come up with enough music to have an album. The other thing on side 2, there's a 15-minute long Ginger Baker song, which I actually kind of like. It's called Do What You Like. And I think it shows the kind of creativity of Ginger Baker. It's in 5/4, and it's kind of a jazz, almost like it's got 5/4 time is sometimes used in Turkish music too. I think it's a kind of an Arabic feel. I don't know if I should use the word exotic, but it's got a kind of mystical vibe to it in that 5/4 time. However, it is 15 minutes long, and it takes up most of side 2, and I think some people would say that was kind of filler. There's a big long drum solo. Everybody takes a big long solo. I think it's cool. It shows Ginger Baker, you know, he kind of came up with the jazz rock type song, I think, and it's actually, when I was a kid, I didn't take to it as much, but now that I'm older, it might be one of my favorite songs on the album. But it is 15 minutes long and kind of free form, and I think it shows that they were, to an extent, kind of filling up album space. So that's an interesting thing about the album, is I don't think they had the material. They kind of put together some material. And even with that, I love Sea of Joy is my favorite song on this album. I love Had to Cry Today, though. And I think when you took a guitar player like Clapton and then a singer and songwriter like Stevie Winwood, you know, right away you had some pretty good songs. You know, it's too bad they couldn't have sat around and played for a year. Man, they would have maybe had one of the greatest albums ever, because they ended up doing a pretty good album, just throwing together a couple songs, and that was pretty much all they had. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this album that shows again that it didn't kind of live up to what it was supposed to be, but this was right around the time in the United States the band was becoming popular, and kind of groups that did those big long 20-minute solos like Hendrix or for that matter Cream were, at least in some quarters, falling out of favor. And the band, that music from the Big Pink album was so influential, and it had that kind of earthy, organic sound. It was very Americana sound, but you know, the English have their own version of that, English folk music. So that was obviously going to be a huge kind of sound in the 70s that would lead to all kinds of groups, you know, whether it's Southern rock or even groups like the Eagles. Sort of my favorite period of Dylan, that kind of mid-70s period of Dylan. All that kind of had its founding, at least an important moment in its founding, in that late 60s period. And the band was such an influential group. So one of the things they thought right away was that maybe Blind Faith could be like the English version of the band. But they didn't have enough material to do that. So they do this album that they kind of did fairly hastily with, I don't want to say covers, because I think some of the songs are good, but it sounded like they used every good song they had. But then they went on a tour, and one of the other thing that happened on the tour is once they got out playing, they've got Stevie Winwood and Eric Clapton, and people didn't want to necessarily hear Sea of Joy. They didn't want to hear Had to Cry Today. They wanted to hear Sunshine of Your Love and White Room and Politician and, you know, Tales of Brave Ulysses. So they went on this tour, and they've got this album that was at least somewhat, you know, kind of a serious album. And then you've got, you know, a stadium full of, you know, 8,000 or 9,000 people, and they're all saying, White Room, White Room. So right away they kind of fall into the trap that Eric Clapton and probably Winwood too were actually trying to escape, which was these big long jams, just kind of playing to the crowd. And their tour ended up being kind of playing a lot of old Cream songs, old Traffic songs, and to some extent just an appearance of the great Steve Winwood, an appearance of the great Eric Clapton, an appearance of the great Ginger Baker, as opposed to being a band. And I think that was one of the it's kind of too bad, because when I listen to Sea of Joy with that really kind of cool folksy rock violin, it's very English if you think about it, you know. You kind of wonder what might have been, you know. But the other thing that happened on that tour was there was a little warm-up band for Blind Faith on the American tour called Delaney and Bonnie Bramlett and Friends. And on that tour, they had a couple people. One of the guys that played bass was a man named Carl Rattle. The guy that played keys was a guy named Bobby Whitlock. I think Jim Gordon was the drummer. I'm not sure, but it was definitely Bobby Whitlock and Carl Rattle. And this Delaney Bonnie, everybody says he was a really colorful and kind of charismatic figure. And he was just Southern America roots, you know, kind of a good old boy. But like a lot of good old boys, really, really smart and in his own kind of colorful, down-home way. And Eric Clapton really took to this guy. And Eric Clapton kind of started hanging out with Delaney and Bonnie. Blind Faith would kind of go, they were all like stars, and they would kind of go to their respective hotel rooms and show up for gigs. And Delaney and Bonnie were like a family. They had this band, and they would sit in hotels and play. They would play in airports. They would break out into all these great harmonies on the airplane or on buses. And that was kind of what Eric Clapton was looking for in Blind Faith, it sounds like. And that was kind of what the band had, too, that Eric Clapton kind of wanted. And so by the end of the tour, Eric Clapton was really kind of enamored with Delaney and Bonnie. And at the end of the tour, he and Winwood kind of dissolved the band. I don't even think Ginger Baker knew about it right away. And of course, Rick Grech, great bass player, did a absolutely fine job. But he was kind of along for the ride, it sounds like. So Winwood and Clapton dissolved the band, and even without telling Ginger Baker about it. And Eric Clapton pretty immediately began a tour with this Delaney and Bonnie and Bobby Whitlock, which ended up being a record, Delaney and Bonnie and Friends on tour with Eric Clapton, which is an important Eric Clapton album and a damn good album, maybe a better album than the Blind Faith album. And that sort of, it's just interesting. This is such an interesting period in Eric Clapton's career. All the pieces are kind of falling into place, but the puzzle's not all there yet. So he's got this kind of hard rock blues thing that's kind of under his belt. He's done a lot of that. Blind Faith was kind of doing some kind of psychedelic folk stuff that was kind of cool. But then he fell into this kind of Americana music, this Southern sound, which fits his guitar playing very well. And really what was happening was, that band, without Delaney and Bonnie, that core of that band, that rhythm section, would end up becoming Derek and the Dominoes. So he kind of met the core of Derek and the Dominoes on that Blind Faith tour. And of course, and then he also did that first solo album of his with like Let It Rain, Blues Power, Never Been So Lonesome and a Long Way From Home, Easy Now. He did that coming out of Blind Faith too with those same people. And so when Blind Faith broke up, it didn't even last a year really. But out of that came this association with Delaney and Bonnie and the Delaney and Bonnie Bramlett Band, which would include Carl Rattle and Bobby Whitlock, and I'm pretty sure Jim Gordon. If not, Jim Gordon was at least on that first Eric Clapton solo album. So they kind of stepped right out of that. And Eric Clapton, with Delaney Bramlett's encouragement, recorded that first solo album, which maybe wasn't the best solo album he ever did, but in some ways it might have been his most important because it showed that he could be a solo artist. And it had a lot of these influences, including that kind of Americana, I don't want to say it's American influence, but, it was R&B and, had some horns, and it was just a really cool album in its way for its time. And then after that, the core of that band went on to be Derek and the Dominoes, and indeed, Carl Rattle ended up playing with Clapton all the way through the late 70s. I think was it 1980 or 79. So that was a long relationship. So in some ways, this album, you could say it kind of fizzled. The tour was a good time, I'm sure. The crowds loved it. But in Blind Faith, the musical end of it and the concept of what it was, which was never all that clear, maybe, it kind of fizzled. But out of it would come really important components of the Eric Clapton solo career. So it's a very important period in music, and sort of both in American and British music. That said, I like this album. I think it's a good album. When I hear it, I always think, man, what could have been? It's got that Steve Winwood, that kind of folk element, which you kind of would hear like on, John Barleycorn Must Die and some of that Traffic stuff, that kind of atmospheric thing like the Low Spark of High Hill Boys. That element was kind of an embryo on this album, and you can hear it, and it's very cool. It's too bad they didn't have longer to record the album, and that the album itself wasn't more the focus, because once they went on tour, the focus was on Steve Winwood, the focus was on Eric Clapton, the focus was on Ginger Baker, not Blind Faith. So it kind of shot itself in the foot, and that's really too bad, because if you listen to this album, there's some really good moments on this album. It's a good album. I think it's a good album. I think it holds its own. I think it's of its time. I think you if you want to be critical, you can hear that, they didn't have enough material. Clapton came up with that one song, Presence of the Lord, and then they did a cover song. But it's still a good album. It's still a good album. I wish if they could have taken another 6 months to just sit around and mess around, play all the time, jam, whatever, party, jam. I bet they would have come out with a even 10 times better album. But this album, just on the strength of the talent on it, is a good album. It's a good album. So you can appreciate the history of it and the significance of it and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's also a good album. I think it's a good album, and I recommend it. You can listen to it with sort of those qualifiers, but it's a good record. It's definitely a good record, and I recommend it. And so Blind Faith, it's an important album. When you think about it, but when Cream broke up and then Blind Faith formed, and then they did that tour of America, and he met Delaney and Bonnie, that's probably one of the most important periods in Eric Clapton's career. Unfortunately for Ginger Baker, after Blind Faith broke up, he has had a group called Air Force. I'm going to do a little vignette on Ginger Baker. He had a group called Air Force, and he had kind of great stars would come in. But it's that material problem again. It's kind of hard to base a band around a drummer. You could do it, certainly, not to disparage drummers, but you've got to have good songs. And I was watching some of that old Ginger Baker Air Force. I remember when they would be around and you'd see their albums in the stores. But it also, again, it looked like they would always be the lineups were changing a lot, and it never really settled down into a band with its own catalog of sort of songs that you really associate with that band. And they play well, though. It's kind of interesting music, Ginger Baker. But he ended up kind of, I don't want to say sliding, but by the end of the 70s, he had kind of he still played all through the 80s and 90s, I think, in different projects and things. And I like Ginger Baker, but this was probably his, coming out of Cream and then doing Blind Faith, and he never really, I don't think, recovered from the band breaking up. I think he didn't want it to break up. Meanwhile, Steve Winwood went on to play in Traffic, which in some ways realized more of what Blind Faith could have been, and the Eric Clapton solo career is also more of a realization of some of the potential of Blind Faith. And you can hear elements of Traffic, elements of the Eric Clapton solo stuff in this album. And that's what makes it so cool, because Traffic and Eric Clapton are pretty different, but they work really well together. And it's just too bad that they didn't have more time and sort of to do that. It's kind of funny. I think stardom and money and hype and probably a party atmosphere on the road, all those things kind of pushed them out, and they ended up doing all these kind of wild concerts where they would basically just play everything, kind of the fan favorites. Which is fine. If you want to, hey, pleasing the crowd is rule number one, That is rule number one, and they did do that. But the Blind Faith part of it kind of suffered. But out of that came the association with Delaney and Bonnie Bramlett, and out of that came, really so much. And then Traffic really kind of, when Steve Winwood left this band, some of the things I think he was doing here, and he'd already been flirting with some with Traffic, because the Traffic had like an early version of Dear Mr. Fantasy, but they redid it after this. And so I think you can hear elements of Traffic, elements of Eric Clapton on this album, and it's really cool to listen to. And, it stands alone as a good album. So I recommend you listen to it. I hope you like it. And it's an important chapter in the life of American music, British music, Eric Clapton, Stevie Winwood, and it's of its time. God bless you. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays.